Not every mistake is born from fear. Sometimes, it's arrogance that seals our fate.
Be plain to Montana in June 1876 are a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving. As the sun dips low on the horizon, the prairie is drenched in golden light that slowly bleeds into violet shadows, stretching as far as the eye can see. The air hums with the sound of insects and the relentless wind. A wind that has witnessed centuries of change, carrying whispers of ambition, tragedy, and fate. On this land, every breeze, every shadow seems to echo with stories long forgotten or warnings yet unheeded. It is the eve of one of the most infamous disasters in American history. But if you were standing here amidst the rippling grass and the darkening sky, you might not sense the doom that is gathering. There is a deceptive calm, the world holding its breath. The U.S. 7th Cavalry makes camp just beyond the curve of the Little Bighorn River. Tents scattered like pale ghosts across the plain. Horses graze. Soldiers murmur over campfires. The scent of coffee and pipe smoke drifts on the breeze. Among them, some are brimming with confidence, certain that tomorrow will bring glory. Others, more perceptive or perhaps just more anxious, feel a chill deeper than the night air. This place is sacred hallowed ground to the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne, whose ancestors hunted and prayed here for generations. Their presence lingers, almost tangible in the sigh of the wind and the flicker of firelight. Across the river, their great camp stretches along the banks. Be a community alive with stories, rituals, and a silent awareness that change is coming, whether in triumph or devastation. In the midst of the cavalry camp, General George Armstrong Custer stands apart. The golden hair that earned him the nickname Yellow Hair catches the last rays of daylight. Is he thinking of glory and headlines, of the career that soared so high, so young? Or is there a shadow of doubt, a whisper of warning in the back of his mind? History will debate his motives forever. Before now, the only certainty is that night is falling, and that tomorrow the destiny of hundreds, perhaps, nations will be rewritten in blood and legend. As you watch the last light fade, how many disasters began beneath skies this peaceful? How often is disaster only visible in hindsight, after the silence breaks? Tonight, the stage is set. The fatal error is already in motion. The summer of 1876 was supposed to be a time of celebration for the United States. Across the country, people gathered for the centennial 100 years since the Declaration of Independence. Proud cities buzzed with optimism, and the American flag flew proudly over parades and fairs. But far from Philadelphia and the newly illuminated streets of the East, the Great Plains were tense, their golden beauty masking a looming crisis. Montana, with its rolling prairies and winding rivers, was a land coveted by settlers and the railroad barons, pushing the nation's destiny westward. But this landscape was not empty. It was home to the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. whose connection to the land went back generations. The Little Bighorn River, with its cottonwoods and cool water, was sacred ground, place of tradition, memory, and resistance. True. For the Lakota, these lands weren't just home. They were the heart of their universe. The Black Hills, not far to the south, were home. But in 1874, everything changed. Custer himself led an expedition to the Black Hills, announcing the discovery of gold. That single event unleashed a flood of miners and fortune, trampling the treaties that had promised the region to the Lakota. As long as the grass shall grow. The government's response was blunt. Move the tribes onto reservations or be treated as enemies. Defiant, many Lakota, Cheyenne, and their allies left the agency land, following Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and other leaders who vowed to protect their people and way of life. By early summer, thousands had gathered near the Little Bighorn, united by visions and warnings. Sitting Bull's famous Sundance, in which he mutilated his own arms in prayer, brought a vision of soldiers falling into camp like grasshoppers. Pith prophecy, widely told and believed, gave hope and urgency to the resistance. The U.S. Army saw the gathering as an act of rebellion. 3 military columns, totaling more than 2,500 men, were sent to force the tribes back into reservations. The 7th Cavalry, George Armstrong Custer, was the spearhead of this campaign. Custer eager for glory and mindful of story, relish the prospect of a decisive victory that could cement his legend and perhaps revive political ambition. The stakes for both sides could not have been higher. For the native nations, it was a fight for home, family, and survival. For the U.S., it was a question of progress and dominion, and assertion that the American century would not be denied. The collision was inevitable, and all the ingredients for catastrophe were in place. What does it mean in history when one nation's dreams become another's nightmare? The background of the Battle of the Little Bighorn is not just about armies, but about land, betrayal, and the desperate, unyielding hope of a people refusing to disappear. Before the world knew his name for disaster, George Armstrong Custer was a man made for legend. B was born in Ohio in 1839, a boy with a restless spirit, golden hair, and boundless ambition. Even as a cadet at West Point, he stood out, though not always for the right reasons. P was notorious for breaking rules and gathering demerits, yet his daring and charisma were impossible to ignore. When the Civil War erupted, Custer's look and appetite for risk found its calling. He rose swiftly through the ranks, becoming the youngest Union brigadier general at just 23 years old. Custer's style was as flamboyant as his courage. He rode into battle wearing a crimson scarf, with long locks flying behind him, leading dramatic cavalry charges that were equal parts brilliance and recklessness. Some called him a born leader. Others thought him dangerously impulsive. He courted fame as much as he courted danger, has made him a hero. The end of the Civil War did not end Custer's quest for glory. With the West as the new frontier, Custer found a stage as colorful and violent as any battlefield. He led the 7th Cavalry in campaigns against native nations, often with tragic, brutal consequences. His public image grew thanks to both his wife, Libby, who became his most devoted advocate, and his own flair for self-promotion. Custer wrote articles, gave interviews, penned, and embraced his celebrity on painting himself as a symbol of American destiny, rugged and unyielding. But there was a shadow beneath the shine. Custer was known for insubordination, ignoring orders when it suited him, and alienating both fellow officers. He hungered for recognition and often acted first, thinking of the consequences only later. This pride was both his greatest strength and deepest flaw. As the Little Bighorn campaign approached, Custer's reputation was mixed. To some, he was a hero in need of a comeback. His career had stalled, and a stunning victory could restore his luster. To others, he was reckless, a risk to himself and his men. Even among his own officers, doubts. Imagine the scene. The golden-haired general riding ahead of his men, seeking the thrill of battle, vindication of headline. Did he sense that the West was changing, that the tactics of the Civil War could not guarantee victory here? Or was he blinded by the myth he had built around himself, a myth that would soon collide with the reality of the plains? In Custer, we see the paradox of American ambition, brave, restless, and too often heedless of warnings. What would you have thought, watching him ride into the unknown? As the 7th Cavalry rode ever closer to the Little Bighorn, the tension in the air became as thick as the dust rising behind their horses. The landscape itself seemed to warn them. Distant thunder rumbled across the plains. Herds of antelope scattered at the cavalry's approach, and the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint, uneasy scent of smoke. Soldiers whispered among themselves, sharing rumors and stories about the native forces gathering ahead, stories that grew darker with each passing day. Custer's scouts, many of them Crow and Arikara seasoned in the ways of the plains, brought back alarming reports. What lay ahead was no small band of hostiles, but the largest native encampment any of them had ever seen. By hundreds of tippis lined the riverbank, and the warriors counted in the thousands. Some scouts insisted that the camp stretched as far as the eye could see, a sight both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The warnings did not end there. Scouts urged caution, suggesting that they wait for reinforcements from the other army columns, by under Generals Terry and Gibbon. Even some of Custer's officers were uneasy, suggesting a pause or a careful reconnaissance before launching an attack. By Custer, true to form, was undeterred. He was convinced that speed and surprise were his greatest ally. We feared that delay would allow the native families to slip away, scattering into the hills and robbing him of the decisive victory he craved. His decisions became more daring and more questionable. He refused the use of Gatling guns, believing they would slow his march. He split his regiment into 3 battalions, planning a complex attack from multiple directions. Such a division might have been brilliant against a smaller or less organized enemy. It would prove disastrous for the native leaders. The signs were read differently. In the camp, Sitting Bull's vision during the sun dance was shared in hushed tones. Soldiers falling into the village like grasshoppers from the sky. Warriors painted their faces, tied feathers in their hair, and sharpened their weapons. Women and elders prepared for flight, or for the worst. Crazy Horse, quiet and enigmatic, rode among the warriors, instilling resolve. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, a commander pushing for speed and glory, brushing aside the warnings of both friends and foes. And the other, a community united by prophecy and the knowledge that everything family, freedom, future hung in the balance. It was only a matter of time before warnings would become reality, and bravado would meet its test. On the other side of the Little Bighorn River, the world was very different from the tense and anxious camp of the 7th Cavalry. Here, in the vast expanse of the Great Sioux Camp, thousands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho gathered in what was both a sanctuary and a bastion of resistance. The village itself was a marvelous city of hundreds of tipis stretching along the riverbank, smoke curling from countless cooking fires, the air alive with laughter, songs, and the steady rhythm of preparation. For the people here, this was more than a military encampment. Entire families, grandparents, mothers, children, uncles, aunts had journeyed from distant agency lands to join the great gathering. They came not only for safety in numbers, but for ceremony, for renewal, and to stand as one against the encroaching threat. The mood was vibrant and solemn all at once. Elders told stories. By the fire, warriors painted their faces in ritual patterns, and young children watched as their world transformed into a fortress of hope and defiance. Leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse moved through the camp with quiet authority. Sitting Bull, whose vision of falling soldiers had inspired hope and determination, Bow now offered prayers and led sacred ceremonies. He reminded his people that they fought not just for today, but for the right of their children and grandchildren to live free. Crazy Horse, less a speaker and more a doer, rode among the warriors, checking weapons, speaking softly, his presence a calming force amid growing anxiety. The camp was not all calm. However, every family knew the danger that approached. Some women and elders prepared for flight, gathering precious belongings and food, tying up horses, keeping the youngest children close. Yet, even in this uncertainty, there was a sense of unity rarely seen before. Tribes that were sometimes rivals had joined together, bound by a common cause and a shared determination that their way of life would not vanish without a fight. The Lakota and Cheyenne, many armed with repeating rifles or Winchester carbines traded for buffalo robes and horses, did not underestimate the threat. Yet, they also had the advantage of home, They knew the land, the rivers, and the rhythm of the season. Scouts watched the movements of the cavalry with practiced eyes, signaling every change, every new cloud of dust. As night fell, the camp grew quieter, but the sense of resolve only deepened. Some warriors sharpened knives and checked arrows. Others spoke quietly of loved ones, of visions, of dreams in which victory or doom might be foretold. Be it all knew that by dawn the fate of nations might be decided on these sacred days. The dawn of June 25th, 1876, arrived heavy with anticipation. On both sides of the Little Bighorn, the world seemed to hold its breath. The cavalry, restless and eager, broke camp in the grey light. Custer, driven by impatience and the lure of a decisive blow, ordered an immediate advance. He believed that only swift action would bring victory. Hesitation, he thought, would let the village escape into the vastness of the plains. Major Marcus Renault led one detachment forward, splashing across the river and up the bluffs to strike the village's southern end. At first, the soldiers saw little resistance. But as they pressed into the heart of the camp, the air erupted with shouts and gunfire. Warriors appeared seemingly from nowhere, charging on horseback, firing rifles and bows, unleashing a storm of confusion and panic. Reno's men were quickly overwhelmed. Some fired blindly, others turned back in fear, retreating through dense brush and across the river under a hail of bullets and arrows. Horses screamed, men fell, and chaos reigned. Renault, nearly losing control of his battalion, managed to regroup a battered force atop the bluffs, desperately awaiting help. Meanwhile, Custer, separated from Renault and the main column, drove his own men north, intending to flank the village and strike a decisive blow. But Custer's intelligence was dangerously incomplete. He vastly underestimated both the number and resolve of his opponents. As his companies advanced, they were met not by a fleeing crowd, by a swelling tide of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors many, armed with repeating rifles, or with home ground advantage and utter determination. The two columns of soldiers now found themselves cut off from each other, outnumbered. Communication broke down. Custer's officers scanned the rising dust and gun smoke for any sign of help. The battlefield was a whirl of thunderous hooves, war cries, rifled reports, and the acrid smell of powder and fear. For the native warriors, the moment was electrifying. Evoked, they fought not just with weapons, but with memory, with the knowledge that this land, these families, were worth every risk. Young men who had never fought before joined the ranks, driven by prophecy and the urgent hope for survival. Within hours, the open plains were transformed from tranquil sanctuary to a theater of carnage and confusion. The scale and intensity of the fighting stunned even the veterans among both sides. For the U.S. soldiers, the plan was unraveling fast. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, victory began to feel possible. The real battle for the future of the plains had begun already. The cost was unimaginable. By late morning, the sun beat down on the hills and coulees north of the Little Bighorn, casting long, sharp shadows over a battlefield that had become a maze of confusion, panic, and courage. Custer and approximately 210 men found themselves increasingly isolated, hemmed in by a growing tide of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who knew the land intimately and used every ravine and bluff for cover. The dream of a swift, glorious victory had dissolved. Now, the only question was how long they could survive on a low ridge that would forever after be known as Last Stand Hill. Custer and his men hastily formed a defensive perimeter. Horses were shot and dragged into position as makeshift barricades. Soldiers reloaded their carbines, some with shaking hands, others with grim resolve. Ammunition belts were passed desperately down the line. Eyes darted from the swirling dust to the flash of feathers, the sun glinting off painted shields, and the ominous approach of hundreds of warriors. The native fighters pressed their advantage with courage, speed, and coordination. Led by men like Crazy Horse and Two Moons, they darted in and out of cover, unleashing a hail of bullets and arrows. War cries and drum beats echoed over the hills, mingling with the crack of gunfire and the shouts of desperate men. There was no escape. Every route was blocked, every gully covered by eyes that missed nothing. Stories from Lakota and Cheyenne, oral history, paint a vivid picture. Some soldiers tried to break out, only to be cut down in a crossfire. Others huddled behind dead horses, firing until their rifles jammed or their ammunition ran dry. Some, realizing all hope was gone, wrote hurried letters or prayer, tucking them inside pockets for loved ones who would never see them again. Custer himself was a visible presence in the chaos, moving along the line, shouting encouragement, sometimes firing his pistol, sometimes simply watching the fate he attempted finally close around him. Legends abound, some say he died early in the fight, others that he stood to the last with his men. All that is certain is that within less than an hour the fighting ended in complete silence. Not a single man of Custer's immediate command survived. When the smoke cleared, Last Stand Hill was littered with spent cartridges, broken weapons, and fallen men. The native warriors, victorious, yet somber, moved among the bodies. The battle's consequences would reverberate for generations. This was the end not just for Custer, but for an era, a way of war, and the myth of American invincibility on the plains. In the hours and days that followed the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the quiet that settled over the hills was both profound and haunting. Where chaos and gunfire had raged, there was now only the sound of the wind moving through tall grass and the distant cries of birds. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho pride. It was a rare and overwhelming victory won that brought pride and sorrow in equal measure. For the United States Army and the wider nation, It was an unthinkable defeat that would echo across the country and around the world. But the victors moved through the aftermath with solemn purpose. Women and elders mourned the dead and tended to the wounded, both native and, at times, enemy. Warriors collected fallen weapons and horses, burying their own with songs and prayers. There was little celebration, even craziers, whose tactical brilliance had been pivotal or somber. Many understood that this victory, as sweet as it was, could not change the balance of power forever. They feared, rightly so, that retaliation would be swift and relentless. For the 7th Cavalry, the defeat was total. When the bodies of Custer and his men were discovered days later by relief columns, the sight was harrowing. The men had fallen in clusters, some still clutching empty carbines or bloodied sabers. Custer himself was found among his brothers and officers, marked by the violence of battle and the burden of command. News of the massacre stunned the United States. Newspapers painted Custer as both a tragic hero and a reckless fool, while politicians called for vengeance. In the months that followed, the U.S. government responded with overwhelming force, pursuing the Plains tribes across the Dakotas, Montana, and beyond. One by one, the villages broke apart. Hunger, winter, and relentless pursuit wore down, even the most determined. Within a year, the great gathering at the Little Bighorn was scattered, and the era of the free plains and nations was named at an end. But the legacy of Little Bighorn would endure far longer. For native peoples, it became a symbol of unity and resistance, a moment when the impossible had been achieved, if only briefly. For America, it was a painful lesson about arrogance, misunderstanding, and the limits of power. Even today, last Stand Hill is a place of mourning and memory, its winds carrying the voices of both the conquerors and the conquered. What did Custer's fatal error teach the world? It's that underestimating an opponent, ignoring local knowledge, and letting pride dictate decisions can turn the course of history in a single day.
History does not forgive. Avoid the same fatal mistake. Like this video and subscribe to the channel before fate comes for you.